I don't recall either Laura Tyson or Mike Boskin mentioning this, and I don't remember either of you mentioning it either. So I'm curious, is there no possibility of a VAT in any of this? Either of you want to comment on that?
Well, I have to say that on the Fiscal Commission, I repeatedly raised the question of a VAT. I did because Congressman Camp, chairman of the Ways and Means Committee in the House, and I, on the Fiscal Commission, were given the responsibility to lead all the sessions on revenue. And so we brought in the best thinkers from whatever philosophical persuasion to the Commission to give us recommendations. Almost the unanimous recommendation of the experts that came, again from whatever philosophical stripe, is that we ought to go to a hybrid system, one that had an income tax component and a tax on consumption as a component, that would improve the incentive in our systems for savings and investment, and thereby improve economic growth. But every time I raised it, it was vehemently opposed by those who said that would be a second tax system. I mean, even if you were generating the same amount of revenue, they would oppose it because they were afraid of what could happen. You know, Larry Summers famously said, we'll get a VAT when Republicans realize that it taxes those of the lower income at a higher rate, and when Democrats realize it's a money machine. But, you know, it's very hard to see how we're going to get a consumption tax component.
The Domenici-Rivlin task force that went together, working along side by side with Bo Simpson, reformed the tax code and did a number of the things that everybody has spoken about here today that would like to see happen: lowering the rates, having only 2 rates, lowering the capital gains rate, lowering the corporate rate, eliminating a number of the exemptions and deductions, reforming a number of the provisions of the tax code, simplifying the tax code. And quite frankly, after we went through all that, we couldn't, and with all the spending reductions that we still couldn't get to 60% of GDP. So at the end, there was put into that Domenici-Rivlin proposal a 6.5% national debt reduction sales tax to be kicked in the future. It was to be phased in into the future. So it's still out there, but as the chairman says, it is very difficult at this time in the near future to be considering a consumption tax.
Okay. Okay, questions from the audience? Alan. I need a microphone right here.
Yes, healthcare question.
This is Alan.
With all due respect, Senator, my fellow Stanford alumnus, you said something that Laura Tyson said this morning that I really objected to, is some people were saying every idea for cost containment was included in the, I can't bring myself to call it the Affordable Care Act because it's the Unaffordable Care Act. But anyway, every idea was included. Now, there were some ideas out there, such as a bill co-sponsored by your colleagues Ron Wyden and Bob Bennett with 16 senators, which was to do a thorough overhaul of the basic incentives in the system by having a kind of managed competition model where everybody would have choices, would be fully responsible at the margin for the cost of their choice, and there would be standards for the competing insurance plans. We'd have cost-conscious consumer choice and so forth. So 16 senators thought that was a good idea. More recently, the same idea has surfaced with what we've been referring to as Domenici-Rivlin, Wyden, Ryan, etc. That is, get at the basic incentives, and there, through that, the basic organization of healthcare. It's much more fundamental than the ineffective things, the little ideas here and there that were thrown together in the pot of BPACA. So how can you say that every idea was included when these important ideas were apparently ignored?
I was wrong. Look, if I said certainly not every idea was, but, I was on the finance committee. I sat through the endless hearings we had. We did really try to put in as many of the ideas as we got back. If you look at the letter that Senator Gregg, the ranking Republican on the Budget Committee, and I sent CBO, virtually every idea that came back from CBO as helping control costs were included in the Affordable Care Act. The initiative that you've mentioned was not. 16 senators doesn't make a majority. 16 is a good start, but you have to get to 60. I do think there are a lot of very good ideas that are in what Senator Wyden and Congressman Ryan have been working on. But they don't have a finished product. They don't have something in writing, and there's some disagreement between them even now. But I do think the one thing that CBO told us, or one of the things, not just one, they told us many things, was you've got to change the way you pay for health care. That doing this the way it's being done, paying for procedures, is an incentive just to do more procedures, whether they're efficacious or not. So I do think that's a central point. Now, I think you've understated, frankly, in fairness, what's in the Affordable Care Act, because there is a pilot to go at that very question, and it's a very unusual pilot because it changes the way you pay for health care. And if the pilot proves to work, it can be extended nationally without further legislative authorization. So I'm more optimistic about what that might produce than apparently you are. But I just say to you, that really goes to the heart of changing the way we pay for health care.
Questions over here? The mic.
I have never heard anybody describe the value of the assets owned by the U.S. government. They own vast quantities of land in the West. They own businesses, and I have highways and et cetera. I have no idea what that's worth. Does anybody?
That's a good question.
It's in the budgeting.
Well, you want to go first?
Go ahead, Mr. Chairman.
I'm not going.
No, look, you're exactly right. We got all kinds of assets. Some of those assets could be sold. One asset that is out there is spectrum. And, you find spectrum being used as an offset almost everywhere you look. So I think it's oversubscribed in terms of the number of proposals for spending it. But to me, there are assets that could be sold. It's really quite amazing when you look at the inventory of what's in the federal government, just in terms of the state of California. You go around the state of California and look at some of the remarkable assets that belong to the federal government.
The Presidio.
Yes, Presidio is one.
Yeah.
Bill, you may have...
The only comment I would have is there is an estimate in the federal budget every time it comes out in terms of adjusting the debt to GDP, the debt figures, by having the finances. It's not as much as you might think it is. I can't remember the exact figure. But remember, it's hard to sell some of these assets. It's hard to sell an aircraft carrier. It's to the private sector. So you have to be careful about how you value those particular assets.
Question back here?
Yeah, I have a short question for Senator Conrad. In the Zimbardo experiment, were you a guard or a prisoner? In the Zimbardo experiment, were you a guard or a prisoner?
I was neither. I was neither. That was done after I'd left the Stanford Prison Experiment, but I'd brought Carlo Prescott to campus. I was a teaching assistant. I brought him to my class, and then we brought him to Phil's general class, and he was such a hit, so fascinating. His insights were so interesting to people, and that's what really led to the prison experiment. But I'd left by the time it occurred. One thing I did want to address, if I could, Bill mentioned my checkered background. When I ran in 1986, I promised I wouldn't run again unless the deficit were reduced. Remember, the deficit was rising rapidly at the time. Well, it came 1992. The deficit was a record. So I announced in April at my state convention I wouldn't seek re-election. So for a period of months there, I thought I was leaving the United States Senate. My records were being sent off to the University of North Dakota, and my staff was leaving. And then the senior senator from North Dakota in September died. And the news media back home took a poll. 2/3 of Republicans thought I should run again to fill out the 2 years of his seat. So I didn't run for re-election to my seat. I ran to fill out the 2 years left on his term. So if you add up my term, I've been elected 5 times, but I've served 26 years. So I served a 2-year term in there instead of 6, filling out his term. And so I am the answer to a trivia question. Because I'm the only senator in history that served in both Senate seats from the same state in the same day. Now, if you're ever asked that question, you'll know the answer.
Okay, there's a question back here. Before that person asked this question, how many people here are from North Dakota? 1? Okay, 2, 3, all right, 2. 2 people from.
And those are just the ones that admit it.
And that's 10% of the population.
Senator Conrad, during the summer, during the negotiations, debate, etc., over the debt, there were several statements that the Democrats on the Budget Committee, all of them, from Bernie Sanders to Mark Warner, yourself, etc., had come to an agreement on a budget proposal. And I looked very, very hard to try to find what that was, and I never actually heard it publicly proposed. Would you care to make news?
Well, we did. I actually gave a speech on the Senate floor and outlined that proposal. So you should be able to find it, but I'd be happy if you reach me afterwards. I'd be happy to send it to you, what that framework was that we'd agreed to. Let me just say, one thing you hear a lot about is there is no budget. I don't quite see it that way. We don't have a budget resolution that was passed last year. We do have the Budget Control Act that was passed. And the Budget Control Act, a resolution, I think a lot of people don't realize, a resolution is purely a congressional document. It never goes to the president for signature. The Budget Control Act was not only passed by both houses, it was signed by the president. And it does set the budget limit for this year and next year. It sets 10 years of spending caps. Most budget resolutions don't set more than 3 years of spending caps. Provides the enforcement mechanism, and also created the special committee to give them the opportunity to reform the entitlements and to have tax reform. Unfortunately, they failed. They didn't come to an agreement. So what we do have is we have the budget in place in terms of the limits for this year and next. What we don't have, and what I believe we desperately need, is a long-term plan, at least a 10-year plan. We probably need a plan beyond that, because a lot of the changes that need to occur go beyond that 10-year window. Chairman Bernanke has advised us that don't be a slave to the 10-year window that CBO provides scoring for. Really, we need to have a longer-term plan, because that's when the entitlements really are uncontrollable.
Okay, there's time for one more question, and there's a Nobel laureate who has a question who happens to be sitting next to my wife. Gary Becker.
Here's your mic. Here you go.
I have a simple question. As I looked at some of the charts, there were projections about the debt-GDP ratio going 10, 15 years forward. Now, I can understand how one can project the tax rates and expenditures, but to project the ratios, you need to be projecting GDP growth. That's a function of the tax rates, the tax structure, and spending. So I'm curious, what was built into these projections about the effect of tax rates and spending on the rate of growth of GDP? Because some of us who believe in flatter taxes, lower taxes, believe that this will be a positive force through increasing the growth rate, through increasing investment, R&D, and the like.
We can get you the underlying assumptions that are the basis for these forecasts. What Bill said is true. The one thing we know about these forecasts, they're going to be wrong. Because if we look historically, they have been wrong. The further you go, I think all of us know in the forecasting business, I used to be in charge of forecasting for my state. It was one reason they sent me to the United States Senate. They'd had enough of my forecasts. And I just say to you, when you get beyond 2 or 3 years, these forecasts are very murky. Bill?
The estimates, at least that I put up, were based upon an assumption of about a 3.1% real GDP growth, which is fairly, I think, consistent with what I believe you presented this morning, Mr. Lipsky, right? That it was just an assumption of 3.1% growth.
Okay. Thank you both very, very much. That was extremely helpful. Thank you. Good job. Thanks. Thank you both.